first, the Prime Minister has now made it official. As he told the Garma Festival in Northern Territory over the weekend, recognising Indigenous people, First Nations people as he likes to call them, in our Constitution is his #1 priority for this term of Parliament. Only don't ask for the detail, because he says you want the detail that could derail the whole process. Just trust the Parliament to get it right after you've changed the Constitution to forever make the decisions of Parliament subject to an unspecified but powerful pressure from an entity that we're not told anything about, except that it will be an Indigenous body and that it'll make representations to the Parliament on matters, whatever they are, relating to Aboriginal people. This is the Trojan horse that the Prime Minister wants to insert into our Constitution, exploiting the abundant goodwill that just about all of us have towards Indigenous Australians. Not that that goodwill's always reciprocated. Here is Victorian Greens Senator Lydia Thorpe today, marching into the chamber with a Black Power salute, and just listen to how she references the Queen as she's sworn into office.
I, Sovereign Lydia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and I bear true allegiance to the colonising Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Senator Thorpe.
You're not a senator if you don't do it.
I'm going to wait for quiet. Senator Thorpe, you are required to recite the oath as printed on the cards.
I, Lydia Thorpe, do solemnly and sincerely affirm and declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law.
Do you really think a voice to the Parliament will mollify Thorpe? Of course it won't. And it's not the end either. I mean, the voice is just the start. Over the past couple of months, I read every document I can get my hands on, all the reports, as many speeches and debates about models as is out there. And there's just so much that's wrong with what's proposed. First, it puts into our body politic a new entity that only members of one race can vote for and only one race can stand for. Honestly, go back a couple of decades and we would have marched in the street opposing any race-based move like this. Yet here we are, using race to somehow make us less race-based and using disunity in order to unite us. The second problem with it is that it gums up government by insisting that both the Parliament and the executive government must take this voice seriously, almost to the point of it having a veto. Because that's almost inevitably what activist courts will insist upon once it's there in the Constitution, with an unspecified authority to make representations about any matters relating to Aboriginal people, which is just about everything from budgets to hospitals to schools and the military. Don't forget it was Malcolm Turnbull, hardly a constitutional conservative, whose reaction to this when it was first raised was to reject it as an unnecessary and divisive third chamber of the Parliament. My third problem is that this voice proposal is just the start, as I said, of dividing our country, with the other elements of the so-called Uluru Statement coming to as commitments from the Prime Minister, namely a truth-telling commission and a treaty, as if any country can make a treaty with itself and its own citizens. A treaty is important for many in the Aboriginal activist movement because it'll set up compensation payments or reparations to be paid by taxpayers for decades to come. You think I'm joking? Here's the ABC's Indigenous Affairs editor, Bridget Brennan.
Actually, this has to be about justice. It has to be about reparations. It has to be about giving some power to Aboriginal communities. The Parliament, while he wants to pull back on saying the Parliament will have ultimate supremacy, of course, but what sort of transfer of power does this mean for Indigenous people? Because that needs to happen.
Now, the Truth-Telling Commission idea deserves attention as well. Now, it might sound benign, but it's really about rewriting history When South Africa went through a truth-telling process at the end of the apartheid era, it was designed to allow people to ventilate allegations about race crimes committed against them in their lifetime, where it was unlikely they'd ever see justice. That's a very different thing to what Labor wants to do here, to establish truth-telling about Australia's settlement going back over 2 centuries. Now, I support an honest telling of history, but I reject, as I think most Australians do, anything that tries to wash away the achievements of those who came before us and sacrificed so much to build this modern nation. Now, I can understand why the new PM wants to crack on with this, because Labor's very aggressive about wanting to own the totems of history, and all PMs have an eye to their legacy. Kevin Rudd, for example, pretty poor PM, but he'll always have a place in Labor history after delivering the apology. But more than a legacy, and despite today's Good News poll, I suspect a good part of what's driving Anthony Albanese here is his awareness that with tough economic times ahead, he needs a distraction, an issue to hold the left together, something he can campaign on as the inflation freight train bears down on his government. He knows Labor can't give every left-wing interest group the spending they demand. He knows he can't help preserve real wages either, despite the campaign promises. And he's got problems with China, keeping the lights on, and more. That's why Albanese is investing so much political capital in The Voice, because he thinks that our collective guilt about what's happened to Aboriginal people in the past, and with the backing of woke establishment, he might get a big win in history terms here. Even though in the end, it'll end up leaving us more divided and less well governed as a nation, without doing anything for the Aboriginal people of remote Australia who've been living in third world conditions for years, despite the billions we've spent and the goodwill on all sides of politics. Now, I'm not surprised that Labor wants this symbolism over substance, and I'm not surprised that activists want their gravy train too, as Jacinta Price nailed it on the weekend. Because the worst outcome for them is that the problems of Aboriginal disadvantage actually get fixed. Because if the problems of Aboriginal disadvantage get fixed, they're all out of a job. But why is the coalition so quiet? This is the side of politics, after all, that put an Aboriginal man into the Senate in Neville Bonner over 51 years ago, before anyone on the left did anything practical to back up their Indigenous rhetoric. Now, for a Liberal Party that believes in the power of the individual over the state, that believes in equality before the law, that rejects political correctness, sitting on the fence over The Voice is a mistake. So too, I have to say, he's a good bloke, but so too is giving Julie and Lisa carriage of this issue in the shadow cabinet over someone like Jacinta Price, given Lisa has long supported The Voice, and as Price so eloquently demonstrated last week with her first speech, her bravery and authenticity already leaves many of her colleagues in the shade.